continent. We had a field trip to Vodacom offices, and where we learned about how one of Africa's largest telecommunications providers does its business on the African continent. We also went to Sons Delta farm yesterday. This morning we discussed the growing presence of China in Africa and what implications that has for our economy and politics. So this morning in this panel we are going to look at all those things and many more, just to reflect from the perspectives of our panelists what they think of those insights and those themes. These are practitioners, people who have done business in the past, but they've also been involved in other capacities in government, in the private sector, as well as in the consulting business. So they are going to share with us their insights this morning. Let me start by introducing Linda Grootboom on my far right. Is currently the Deputy Director General in the Office of the Premier in the Western Cape, but is also an established figure in the corporate world. His background was in the corporate world. He's an entrepreneur. Has written a book on leadership. Is a very regular attendee to our functions here and a participant in our panel discussions and roundtable discussions. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you.
I also want to welcome Gheneez next to me. Gheneez Munian, who was a senior executive at Shell South Africa. She's one of those people who decided she had had enough of the corporate world. She was going to set up her own business. She runs her own business. She'll talk about that, the challenges that she faces, how she overcomes those challenges. And she's a former student here at the UCT GSB, so it's good to always welcome our alumni to the school to help us with the work that we're doing in the school. Welcome, Gheneez. And next to me, I want to welcome Dr. Zanele Hammond. Zanele is a member of faculty here at the UCT GSB. She's a senior lecturer attached to one of our centers called the Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship. Her background is in entrepreneurship and innovation. She studied in Switzerland, and she taught in Switzerland at Zurich, University of Zurich, where she taught a course called Doing Business in Africa. But she's also worked in the private sector, in the investment financial sector, where she was involved in hammering deals with various governments. We'll talk about that, financial deals and related issues. And then on my far left is also somebody who is not new to the school. He's a former student here. He was on the MBA program many years ago. He works as a consultant now for a company called Tiaxa. He widely travels the African continent. He traverses the breadth and the depth of this continent doing business. And it's a fantastic honor for us to have David Nsengiyumva here this morning to share with us his insights about business in Africa, especially the latest trends in terms of business on the African continent. Now, this is how things are going to work. I'm going to invite our panelists to make some opening remarks, and then I'm going to ask them a few questions, and then I'll open the floor for you to comment, to ask questions, and to engage with our panelists. Let me start with you, David. You've just come back from your travels on the continent. What can you tell us about the changing nature of the business environment in Africa? What is happening? What are you observing on the African continent in terms of business today?
Well, let's start talking about my background. I'm in IT, specifically in the financial services sector, in IT in the telecommunication sector, providing financial services through the mobile. So for the past about 6 years, I've been consulting companies like Visa, the international payment company, and other payment services provider to deploy infrastructure for the provision of mobile banking solutions in Africa. So that has been more or less my work for the past about 6 years. Now that sector has actually matured where the basic payment systems are in place for people to conduct payment and payment to person to business transactions. Now we get into the level where we deploy more advanced services like digital credit, digital insurance, digital savings product. At the same time, collaborating with social media provider to be able to harness the data that they have to provide more adequate solution to the different communities in Africa. So that's where we are at now in terms of revolution in that sector. It's basically a sector that touches many environments because it's a combination of financial services and telecommunication services. So most of the providers in certain countries, depending on the regulations, some countries are more banking prone kind of regulations, and other countries are more liberal, more accommodating to non-financial services provider to actually provide those kind of services. And there's also the regulation, because it's a new industry, there's also a regulation that needs to be put in place. So there's a regulator that has to come in on board. We need to run a training session for the regulator to understand that new industry so that they can enact the regulation that we permit that kind of services to be given on the market. There's also the government that comes to play beyond the regulations. Because the telecommunication sector usually depends on the telecommunication ministry or department, while the banking services or financial services depends on the central bank and the Department of Finance. So there's different government department that come into play as well. So the trend at the moment in that sector is basically to bring all these stakeholders together to try to enact the right regulation and put the right business processes in place for the flourishing of that sector. And the reason why that sector is very important on the African continent is because the layout in Africa is that we've got a very, very massive informal sector. And that sector really has a lot of potential, and there's so much money circulating in that sector that is not accounting. So the government loses out a lot because they're not able to tap into that sector to get enough tax or revenue that they could get. There's so many people that are excluded financially, and that has impact because all these transactions that are happening hand to hand, first of all, in terms of outreach, they are very limited because you can only transact with the person that you are with. While if you can be given the channel to transact to people beyond, you could actually transact people who are in the region beyond where you reside. And that really helps a lot in terms of trade, inter-trade in the country. So there's a lot of benefit in trying to bring this informal sector into some sort of formality. And the mobile banking or the mobile banking kind of solutions can help really bring that informal sector into some sort of formality. And the reason why that's possible is because the penetration of the mobile phone in Africa has been tremendous. So they've been able to reach areas that the traditional banks haven't been able to reach. So to convince a bank to set up a branch in a remote area with all the cost added, with all the infrastructure that they need to put in place, to service people who earns $2 or $3, $4 a day, for them it doesn't make economic sense. While everybody in those communities have mobile phone. So the opportunity was that let's use that device as a means for to deploy these banking services to these communities. And in doing so, we bring that massive informal sector into some sort of formality, and the government can tap into that also to increase their revenue base, the tax base. At the same time, give these people the opportunity to do other kind of financial services that they will not be able to do. Like savings, it's very important for them to be able to save. Some people have the capability to save, even if it's $2 or $10 a month. But they're not able to do so because they don't have the financial infrastructure around them. Give them enough credit so they can be able to increase their financial capabilities and trade. So that's where I've been kind of area that I've been involved in. And it's very interesting now. Very recently, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook was actually in Kenya trying to see how we can integrate these kind of payment services with the social media, because the social media, they hold so much data about these people that we can be using to know the needs of these people and tie them to the financial needs of these people and really customize the financial services that we offer to the mobile to the needs of each of the different communities.
Thank you very much, David. Zanele, could you please share with us your views about what's happening in terms of business on the African continent, based on your experience? What did you do in the past, and what was your experience, and what lessons can we learn from that? And perhaps you can integrate that with the work that you're doing currently, in the field of entrepreneurship and innovation.
Good morning. I was in banking for 22 years, not as an academic, but as an investment banker. And having studied, I did my MBA and PhD finance in Switzerland, so I worked for the bank there. We used to finance Eastern European businesses, but in the early 2000s, when there was enlargement, the Eastern European companies did not need our finance anymore because they could go to any European bank. We then started financing African companies. And penetrating Africa, I'm born and bred in South Africa, but I've lived abroad for 22 years. So penetrating Africa financially actually reintroduced me to the African continent and the needs that are in the continent. Doing business in Africa, whilst you have to look at the economic side, it is mainly driven by the cultural side, because there's different, in the 52 countries, there's different cultures which you have to adhere when you do business there. Now, in my private capacity, I am a community builder. So coming from a professional side that has economic benefits, and coming from a personal side that has social needs as an African, my interest, my field of research has been in integrating the financial benefits with the social needs. So that's how I got into social innovation and social entrepreneurship in Africa.
Thank you, Zanele. Gheneez, you've had a very interesting experience of having worked at the highest levels in the corporate sector with Shell South Africa, and now you're an entrepreneur. Perhaps could you please share with us your journey, your career journey, and how that has changed from the perspective of doing business. And we spoke at length yesterday about the business environment in South Africa, as well as the role that South Africa plays on the African continent. Could you please say a few words also about how you experience the business environment in the African continent, sorry, in South Africa?
Hi, good day. So I started straight from university in Shell, South Africa, and I really grew as a person and as a career in Shell. That was the one thing about having a good corporate to grow in, because you can actually enjoy different careers in one company. And I worked for Shell for 25 years. I started in IT, and then I worked in the chairman's office, did strategy. Then I did my MBA at UCT at that same time, when BEE, Black Economic Empowerment, was becoming quite a topical issue, and I did my thesis on BEE. So when I came back, I was pregnant over my MBA, and I had my babies during my MBA, which was probably not the best idea, but it worked out okay. And when I came back from maternity leave, I didn't have a job, but then they created a BEE position, and I think that's where my whole passion around development and how do we bridge the gap between the rich and the poor in South Africa came. So my thesis hinged around was it going to work, and was the financial types going to work, and what kind of model would actually work for BEE. So, but my role in Shell at that time was really to say, how as a corporate do we actually embrace the charter and the codes of good practice that the government, the regulations that the government was putting out at the time. And I found that fascinating, and I really believed that it was a really good policy and a good charter, and how do we implement it to the fullest. And I think if you've been in the South Africa domain, there's been a lot of talk about how did it work and how didn't it work. So about 10 years down the line, it's an interesting topic at the moment, which probably needs its own forum. I then I realized that I've got an MBA and I've got a lot of strategy. I really want to know how business works. And I then asked to go into the retail division, where I was the district manager for the Eastern and Western Cape, 200 sites that I had to be the franchisor manager for. And that gave me fantastic experience around actually running a business, cash flow management, how to manage the franchisees, and I really, really enjoyed it. It was. I think I grew quite a lot from a business perspective because I had the practical view around it. As I was in retail, Shell had an opportunity to explore for gas in the Karoo, and they realized that they needed to really make sure that they embrace the regulations around how do we. And because of my background in BEE, they asked me to please come onto their team as a non-technical advisor, manager, to make sure that if they do get the license, then how do we prepare for the license, and how do we prepare a proposition for the government that would actually embrace the social needs, the economic needs, and how do we embrace the huge economic upturn that they were expecting if we did find gas in the Karoo. And I don't know, a lot of you are not from South Africa, but the Karoo is probably one of the most sparse. Water is a scarce commodity in the Karoo. There's lots of social issues. There's a huge opportunity. I wouldn't say issues, but there's a huge opportunity to use any economic activity in the Karoo to actually address some of the social needs, the unemployment issues. So there was a lot of things that if we got the exploration right, we could actually make a huge difference from a social economic thing. So I found that a fascinating challenge, and I worked on that Karoo license application, engaging with stakeholders, engaging with government, and basically building the plans of how we could actually do this. We waited for a long time. There was a lot of, because gas exploration was very new to South Africa. There were a lot of legacy issues around it. It took a long time, and it's still taking time for government to actually approve the legislation, get the legislation right, get the regulations right to actually control the activity. With that, Shell, it was quite a dicey thing to try and keep the investors happy. They're still wanting to invest, I believe. But it took it's about in the 6th year now, 7th year of waiting for regulations. So they decided to downscale the team, but keep a core team to continue. But and through that downscaling, I said I will come back maybe. But in the interim, I really want to do. I just don't want to sit and wait. So I took a retrenchment package, and then last year I decided to go into business. So I've got a clothing business, and I've got 2 retail service stations, Shell service stations, that I'm busy managing and trying to make profitable at the moment. So that's been my journey. But yes, so I think just from my life experience in the corporate world, I think doing business in South Africa particularly has been quite challenging over the last 5 years. I think it's been the political climate has caused complexity, which has also maybe stagnated some of the regulatory progress that could have happened and the economic momentum that we could have got from various initiatives. And for me, that has been a very frustrating thing. I think I've found opportunities within that, and I think that's what we always have to do. When there's a crisis, you've got to find opportunities. And maybe that is what needs to happen, because I think a lot more opportunities for entrepreneurs need to be created in South Africa. I think that is where the main focus for creating jobs is going to be. And I can see it, because I employ now up to 50 people in my businesses. And if I was just sitting at home or doing consulting, I wasn't. But I'm doing a very practical commodity-based or needs-based business, and you're employing people. And I think if that model gets replicated into more, more businesses will have more people and the economy will grow in as well. So I'm not discounting corporate investment and international investment. Obviously that is the huge thing. But in the interim, while the climate is not good, I mean, we're sitting with a zero growth economy at the moment, and so money is scarce, but the way we're going to try and generate it is maybe try and have more small businesses.
Thank you, Gheneez. Linda, you're a senior government leader, somebody also who has been involved in business. Your reflections, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning. Quickly, my background, I've worked in the corporate world for many years. If you know of a company called Soko, talk about load sharing. I've worked for them for many years in the Eastern Cape in Unique. Worked for Ford Motor Company, worked for West Bank, and lots of other companies as well, but ultimately I joined government. What I've picked up from my many years of working in government at all different spheres of government, national, provincial, where I am now, but also worked in local government for the city of Johannesburg, is that government can be a facilitator of this thing we call foreign direct investment. In other words, forging partnerships with other governments that are based abroad, and in that way pave the way for partnerships at corporate level. But also government can be an inhibitor, can be an impediment by way of over-regulating. I think as we're sitting here today, that's one challenge we have. I'll talk specifically about South Africa. We are an over-regulated kind of society, which poses challenge for people who want to come over here and do business with us. I think we can ease up the regulatory regime a little bit. A lot of potential investors will find South Africa very an opportune, fertile ground for investment. One of the challenges we have also is a major skills deficit. And I think the source of that skills deficit is our education system. I'm not talking about GSB level education. This is a top level university, world-class university. The problem is at primary education. It's at basic education level. I think we need a better vision at that level, because this country has fallen into the trap of educating little ones to be job seekers. And it's one challenge that this university is currently turning around, to create MBA graduates who could be entrepreneurs. That's the emphasis of this university. So we've got that major challenge. But talking benefits, mutual benefits. For example, I'll talk about China. I've been part of delegations that have been out there to meet with senior Chinese executives, and I've been part of meetings that hosted delegations from China. What we learn from the Chinese people is a very strong work ethic. Very strong work ethic. You're talking managerial skills, they are superior. And I know we sometimes make this wrong conclusion that everything that is good comes from the USA. It's not the case. I've dealt with Chinese business people, with government officials. They are very good. And there's something also that stands out if you're talking to them. Loyalty, levels of loyalty. What we learn is that if you're a Chinese executive working in a Chinese organization, possibly you've grown there from your years as student, Bertha, up to the level that you become an executive. So it's something we need to learn in South Africa. And I think with this partnership that's been forged between our government and the Chinese government, and also partnership at corporate level, this is what we're learning. Transfer of skills from the Chinese side, advanced technological skills, we're learning a lot from that. But also, since we've got skills deficit here, unemployment is very high. Unemployment in this country is very high. Now with the Chinese corporates investing in this country, setting up assembly operations here, helping us with infrastructure development and so on, there's an opportunity of creating jobs for our local people. And with a bigger tax base, then we can overcome a lot of problems that we have. So I'm one of those who are for this partnership with the Chinese people. In fact, any other countries. I mean, business, global business, means that you've got to forge these partnerships at international level, and you've got to nurture these partnerships and grow these partnerships because there are mutual benefits to be derived from both sides. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Linda. I'll just ask each panelist a question, and then I'll open the discussion to the audience. Just a follow-up question, David. In this telecommunications sector, which is one of the fastest growing and most dynamic on the African continent, where would you say are investment opportunities? If somebody here in the audience were interested in investing in that sector, where are the opportunities there? And how do you see the future trends, future trends in this industry? Where is it going? Zanele, I would like to ask you about your experience, just the lessons that we can learn from your experience of having worked as an investment banker, positive and negative, and what lessons can we learn from that? Gheneez, we had a long discussion about black economic empowerment and economic transformation, and it will be interesting to hear your views as somebody who was integrally involved in developing black economic empowerment policies for Shell. Where do you think we are today? Have we achieved our goals? What mistakes have we made? What can we do, to improve the growing inequalities in our society in a way that is sustainable? Linda, I would like you to elaborate on this relationship between Africa and China. As somebody who's been involved in the coal face, we discussed China this morning, and there are advantages. There are also disadvantages to the relationship. How can African countries better manage their relationship with China? Are we doing enough to manage it, not only in a way that benefits the political and economic elites, but in a way that enables even the broader society to benefit?
Okay. All right. So in terms of where the telecommunication industry or sector I see it evolving, currently there's really challenges in the telecommunication sector. First of all, because the development in technology. So the revenue stream for the telecommunication company used to be the traditional services, voice communication, text, SMSs, etc. So now you have this ubiquitous technology like WhatsApp, Viber, etc. that are really providing the same services at a fraction of the cost. So everybody now is in WhatsApp, Viber, and other technology. So that's eating on the revenue stream of the telecommunication sector. So they have to be innovative to find a way of compensating that. And that's where the mobile financial services has been actually very good, because it has provided them with an opportunity to expand their services, scope of their services, and expand their revenue streams. So, and that has been really a sector that there were huge opportunities, and there still are huge opportunities in that sector. To give you an example, for example, I worked with MTN Rwanda, in a country where it's about 11 million people. They launched their mobile banking solutions about 6 or 5 years ago, and today they are managing transactions worth about $800,000 a day. So that kind of volume, and we are looking at in a country that is very small and 11 million people. In Kenya, it's really exponential. It's way beyond that. And so this now is really where understood the financial services, the send money, the people who need to pay electricity. It's very cumbersome, for example, in Africa, if you have been there to see the infrastructure, for people to go pay electricity, for example. They have to queue, the offices are not well set up to accommodate all these people coming to pay electricity. So giving them, for example, that services where they can pay electricity over the mobile phone, it really alleviates a lot of pressure from the electricity provider, and also facilitated these people. So these are kind of solutions that are being deployed. And more than that, now the most, like a little bit more advanced financial services like credit, savings, and insurance. There's a partner company that we're working with in Tanzania. They've started with about 600,000 worth of investment in the loan portfolio on mobile credit. And now they're sitting about $6 million in terms of volume. And that's about after a year and a half launch the services. So there is really huge opportunity in that sector. And the trend currently is actually now to, because you're dealing with people, the other challenge is there's really systemic challenges in the African continent. Sometimes you don't, not what we take for granted, they're not always there. For example, you might be in an environment where not everybody has an ID number or an ID card. That system is not there. They don't have that. So they can, so it becomes, and also the fact that the enforcing knowing the really holder of the mobile phone. You sometimes don't know exactly, and somebody can take credit or can take whatever and disappear. So it becomes very challenging to actually identify the customer, know their profile very well, and know their movement, and know their needs. Because the infrastructure to know their needs is not in place. So that's where the social media currently, because everybody has now in this day and age, even in the remote area on the continent, people have social media. So that's where you can harness the data that you have in social media to actually work with these financial solutions that we're deploying on the continent to know, for example, some of the products that we've been deploying on the digital credit. We've come to find, for example, that women are much better when handling credit than men. And people who don't move often, who stay in the same location, usually they tend to be better client in terms of paying back the loan you give them than people who move around a lot. So those kind of information, you get it using harnessing the social media information that you have. And the other thing is also everybody, usually you can even look at the pattern, the people they are connected with, and then you can really identify their needs without having to really talk to them. And you can deploy solutions or products that are actually customized to their needs and help them. So the trend that I see where things are going in terms of the telecommunication sector in general is that the traditional revenue streams are really being challenged by evolution of technology. Relying on voice and SMS and text is not possible anymore. You need to be innovative and find other revenue streams. Tapping in other sectors such as insurance, finance, and offering those services using the mobile as a channel, that's another opportunity for revenue streams. And integrating the trend currently with social media to see how we can offer the services that are really, really targeting to those communities. There's a company that I work with in Ivory Coast, for example. It's really challenging for the government to run census and know the people where they are and the numbers, etc. And those statistics are very important to be able to do development programs and assistance program. But the infrastructure challenges is that it's very difficult to run censuses. But the mobile companies have been able to deploy mobile everywhere. So there's a French company, for example, that were really innovative, and they managed to sell to the government of Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire a solution that allows to run census to the mobile phone. And they can know exactly in which village, in which area, how many people there are there, how many children are there, how many women, etc. And the needs also of those communities. And then it helped the government a lot to now design a development program or social assistance program for those targeted communities. So that's where I see, in terms of telecommunication and technology, things evolving.
Thank you very much, David. Zanele?
You know, Africa as a whole, the continent, is really struggling with funding. And international banks have taken advantage of that, and they charge African business huge interest to lend them money. So the one thing I learned through doing business in Africa was the art and benefit of syndication. So the Africans could see that they're being exploited interest-wise, so they find other ways of balancing the monies that they have to pay for accessing funding. So they syndicate. They know that we have resources. I worked mostly in the areas of oil, in the sector of oil. So we have the resource in Africa, and you are bringing money at a huge level. So what they would do, they would then syndicate with international companies that dabble in oil to be able to balance out the costs. And secondly, they would then use our cultural outlook to doing business. even in marriage in Africa, when you come and ask for a bride, we have something called imvulamlomo, which means before you speak to me, just pay me. So we have different strategies culturally where you have to oil our hands to be able to do something. So to balance out the costs of funding, we also have ways that the banks, when they come into our shores to come and do business, where they also have to find a legal stream of paying us.
All right, thank you, Gheneez.
Yeah, so BEE, for me, it was an imperative. It had to happen. It was the only way. If we didn't have regulation, I think we wouldn't have been anywhere as a country. So, from what we've achieved, we've got a much bigger black middle class. We've got more money than would have happened if there wasn't legislation in place. We've got people owning businesses. We've got some very powerful black entrepreneurs that have developed over the last 20 years. How has it translated? Has it been fast enough? No, it hasn't. We still the gap, the Gini coefficient has gone worse, and I think this has been a moment in the last 2 years where people have really started looking back and saying, so what have we done? Why haven't we achieved what we were meant to do? And I think, like anything, the policy was great, but the implementation didn't quite happen as it was intended. So there were targeted individuals that probably benefited more because they just had access to finance, they had the political network, and they got where they are, and they should have got where they are. But how do we now get more black people into the economy is the biggest challenge. And I think we've addressed some of it where skills has played a huge part of it. I think a lot of the skills coming out of schools and universities are not addressing some of the needs that we require. I think we needed more of a job-based economy where there's a lot more manufacturing, a lot more creating and developing more people that can actually create jobs. And I think entrepreneurship is another area where we haven't actually grown in terms of enterprise development and procurement. So part of BEE was around procurement and giving preference to black-owned businesses. And I don't know actually I haven't seen much work being done around how analyzing what has actually happened. I think the 25% bar on equity, where if you were sort of 25% shareholding, it was great. You've met your target. But what does it actually give the black party at the end of the day? There's no control. There's passive investment. It's a passive investment where maybe skills hasn't been imparted. I think maybe offshooting black businesses and mentoring those black businesses to operate and compete against the traditional white businesses in the economy would have probably been a better way. My biggest gripe has been a lot of professional services like legal and accountancy companies. We haven't seen an emergence of black companies, black law firms particularly, competing against the traditionally white-owned companies. And I think that's where we would have got more momentum if we had actually encouraged. What had happened is the black companies that were in existence were actually merged into the traditionally white and diluted their sort of know-how. Yes, they got a lot from infrastructure. There was a lot of infrastructure because that takes a long time to build that infrastructure and know-how and probably the track record around financial stability. But those were the things that I think we should have from a legislative perspective and from a government regulatory perspective, put more emphasis around saying, let's protect the black businesses that did exist and give them a growth path as how they can grow to actually be competing locally but also globally. Because I think that's where the things have gone. But skills development, I think a huge emphasis has to be placed around growing the right skills that can be employable into society, into the economic know-how. And of course the social thinking around social innovation. I'm a very big proponent around how do we grow the economy through finding solutions to our social problems. So there's a hearts and minds element around black economic empowerment and around thinking of and that part, I think we're lagging a bit behind where, because the regulation, which is rightfully so, was put together and said we have to do it, we're lagging a bit around the intention, people's intention around getting it implemented correctly.
Thank you very much, Gheneez. Linda, and then we'll open the floor for questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Three things quickly. I'll start with bilateral trade agreements. I think there's a need that these bilateral trade agreements between African countries and China are crafted carefully. And I think we need an M&E element to be included in that. In other words, monitoring and evaluating these trade agreements ongoingly over time to make sure that the benefits that were targeted when we concluded those agreements are actually achieved by both sides. There are hiccups at this point in time. I think we should be free to talk about these things. There are hiccups in the system. I think basically because some of the Chinese companies that operate in Africa didn't give themselves enough time to understand the culture dynamics. Zanele raised that earlier on, and to understand the regulatory environment that is governing us, laws and so on. For instance, basic hygiene, issues. There are hiccups in areas like Durban that we've reported in the press. We believe those can be overcome through a rigorous induction program. When Chinese companies operate in South Africa, those executives and managerial echelons should be inducted to understand how we operate, to understand the philosophy of Ubuntu. And it works backwards as well. South African companies that operate in China, set up business in China, must also be inducted that side to understand the Chinese culture as well. The other thing I think that could work to strengthen these relations are exchange programs, not only at corporate level, I think at government level as well. It would make sense if you send government officials from South Africa to work in China, say for 6 months or for a year, to understand how the Chinese people run their governments. One thing I think we African countries must learn from the Chinese is swiftly acting against corruption. We tend to tolerate corruption at government level in Africa generally, and in China they do not tolerate that. You are out of the system immediately once it's been proved that you've been corrupt. I think those are some of the things we can learn. And also the other thing is, as I indicated, I've worked in all spheres of government. We're talking about e-workers, we're talking about e-government, but there is very slow movement. We're too paper-based. We run our governments, based on volumes of paper and so on, very, very inefficient. I think that's another point of benefit for us, partnering with China and strengthening relations to learn how do we create paperless work environments and create the e-workers, which I believe would make us more efficient and more effective, both corporate as well as in government. Thank you.
All right, now it's time for you colleagues, questions, comments. I'll take them in rounds. Okay, so first round, questions, comments. Do we need a mic? All right, okay.
Yeah, I have a question around, it's for any of the panelists, around primary education came up as a theme for us throughout this week as an obvious area of improvement, especially in the Black communities. So from any of your experiences on the entrepreneurship side, what are you seeing as maybe something that is promising there, or what do you see as being a model where we can actually, or the country can actually improve the primary education system for the Black community?
Okay, is that a question for Linda?
Could be for anybody, but yeah.
All right. More questions, comments? Let's start at the back over there.
I had a question for Ms. Hammond. I was really curious about just your experiences of first starting with Eastern Europe and then moving to Africa, and kind of the differences in investing in Africa, and kind of wondering if you could unpack a comment like the oil in their hands? Like how do companies move? Like how do the companies do that digitally?
Right.
Yeah. I have a question for David, because you mentioned about the development of moving into social media and also mobile banking. Well, how do you think how fast it will happen? And because what we learned is the data is actually very expensive. So how the infrastructure will catch up with the trend and when the trend will exactly happen. And also about the trust of the bank. A lot of transactions are based on cash. Well, kind of reason is that your trust of the financial system and also inflation. So I would like to know more about that concerns.
All right.
No, just to complement the Bert's question about the primary education, and if you can mention what are the 2-3 most important actions that are in place now, practical, to get this improvement on primary education and consequently to change and increase the middle class power in the region or specifically in some countries or total region.
Okay, shall we start with you, David?
Okay.
Are we ready? Should we start with the... Okay, start with the...
Okay, I'd like to first talk about the primary education. When it comes to entrepreneurship, we always ask the question, is entrepreneurship a skill or an attitude? So if you teach entrepreneurship as a skill, it maybe works at a certain level. But if you start instilling and inculcating entrepreneurship as an attitude to children, then they start thinking differently. Because if you understand poverty, people think poverty is what's in your pocket or what's in your stomach, whereas poverty is actually a mental disease. So by trying to heal that and trying to let children think and see themselves differently, it would be the most important tool that we can instill and inculcate at that level, where entrepreneurship does not have to only be at a business school, but you grow up with it as an attitude and you start seeing yourself differently. So that's one of the innovative answers that are coming, as a contribution to the primary school levels. And to answer the gentleman regarding financing, if I were to compare Eastern Europe and Africa, interestingly, the world is very similar when it comes to money. We all understand money the same. But Eastern Europeans are very interested, because they're also a very poverty-stricken area. So they're very interested in developing their social space. So, Linda says we are over-regulated, but it's very imperative to try and protect ourselves from companies that come from outside and they can just take what they want from the country and go. Whereas the biggest interest is developing the social space. So when you come and do business in our space, what are you leaving behind? What are you doing to develop that space? So Eastern Europeans are very strong at that level to say, you cannot come and take our interest if you're not leaving if you don't leave anything behind. It can be skill, it can be money itself to make sure that we can develop ourselves going forward. So Africans are more polite than Eastern Europeans. So they do things they do things at a milder level. So a lot of companies, we know about ethics. So other people call things bribes, and we call them oiling of our hands. We don't bribe. So if you want to come and do business in a certain area, we then have rules of entry. That's what it is. So we can then give you, or they give you, when you come and do business. Let's say in Equatorial Guinea, you will never do business until you have oiled their hands. Or in Nigeria, you'll never do business until you have oiled their hands. So it's their way of actually leveling the playing fields. But you can come and take your interest, but we have our way of charging the same interest. So at the end, we both benefit equally.
All right, thank you, Zanele. Are you ready now?
Yeah. So if I understand the question was that in terms of, because the data is very expensive, so how is that going to be profitable to conduct that business of over the mobile phone? And currently, it's not so much relying on the data per se because they're using the USSD technology. So it's mostly text-based. So somebody will basically dial a USSD short code and get the menu, the financial services menu on his phone. So any basic phone can actually perform that. So obviously that has limitations. There's some sophisticated services that you can not do. And also there's another limitation in terms of the time that we have to perform that transaction because it's one session, USSD session, and it will last for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. So you have to make sure that in that 3 minutes you've captured all the data that you need from the customer for that transaction and perform that transaction. So usually, looking at the speed of the infrastructure, so far USSD has responded very well. So people are able to send, receive, pay their bills, do the credit transaction or savings transaction in the space of 3 minutes. And those USSD channel has been very adequate for that. So in terms of, it's cash-based because people trust, because they give their cash. Yes, there's an element of truth to that, but there's also limitation. You can only give cash to the person that you are with. So if you need to pay your supplier or somebody that, or if you need to send money to your brother who is in the village, you're not going to be able to send cash. So what people used to do back in the days, they will go to the post office, they will go to the bus station, they will give to the driver, and the driver will give it to the person when they get there and get a commission for that. So there's a lot of risk in that because you're not sure if the money is going to get there, and it depends how long it's going to be, the journey going to be for the driver to get there. But now with these solutions, people are able to send money, and the other recipients will get it instantly. And it's also that the provider of those services have to ensure that the transaction is done end to end with no. They have to earn the trust of the customer. So if somebody does a transaction, you have to make sure the transaction is completely successful. If not, you need to be able to do an audit trail very quickly and reverse the money to the person if the transaction wasn't successful. So you need to earn the trust on the market so that people can trust. So that's basically, I think, yeah. But data is not that expensive. It's expensive in South Africa, but it's not that expensive in another part of the continent as you think. It's extremely, really, like in South Africa, sometimes it's almost close to twice what it will cost in another part of the continent.
All right, Gheneez, do you want to take that question on education? Or you want to give it a skip? Okay,
Linda.
We'll give it to you. Okay, Linda, over to you.
I think Zanele did cover me to a large extent, but I'll just add here and there. One of the things I think we need to teach our children is ethics. I think we need to teach them ethics at the level of primary education or kindergarten level. And also to teach them how to behave with respect. What does it mean to build positive, healthy relations with other people? Because there are bad examples in society throughout the world. It's not just an African thing, throughout the world. This thing of women abuse. You see, we need to teach the little boys at kindergarten level. This is how you treat a woman. You treat a woman as if she is a flower. And indeed, a woman is a flower. My grandmother, when I was still growing up, taught me one thing. If you want to beat up your girlfriend, you use a handkerchief. You beat up your girlfriend with a handkerchief. What it means is you don't beat a woman. Those are things that we should be including in the syllabi at primary level, but also the importance of role modeling. A child at grade 1 should know about GSP. Should know if one day I want to become a top-level executive, there is an institution of higher learning called the GSP. I must go study there one day. And it's not that I want to be an executive only, I can be an entrepreneur. Must know about this world-class institution. But also making use of skills that sit in the corporate sector. I see no reason why private sector executives, top IT guys in the private sector cannot partner with local schools, especially those from the disadvantaged environments. Impart those skills. Let an engineer come there and talk to the kids and teach them mathematics and teach them whatever. But also, the quality of teacher training needs to be improved vastly in our country. Because the teachers we have, educators we have, are like telling. It's a telling thing. They don't encourage little ones to think for themselves. So I would say we must change it so that they become more facilitative, the way Professor Soko does things in this institution. More facilitative, empowering, building people, and encouraging them to think for themselves. Very, very important. Because rote learning is not going to help us at all. I'm not saying maybe qualification of teachers must be checked, but it's the methodology that they use. And if you're a mathematics teacher, you must be a real expert in mathematics. You cannot have passed grade 10 with H or G, and then you ask to teach mathematics. You've got to be a real expert. Thanks a lot.
I just think one of the gaps that we have in education is that we're one of the few countries that take the old education that we had and impose it on our children, and when they finish or go all the way, at the end of it all, they can't be employed because we are giving them skills that our economy doesn't need. So what should happen, and that should happen at our level, what should happen is that we need to conduct research and find out what our economy needs to function efficiently, and based on that, design education that's going to be fed from primary school to be able to train people to serve our economy sufficiently.
All right, thank you. Next round of questions.
I would like to ask for a follow-up question with Ms. Hammond. As you mentioned, like currently there is a gap with the education you have in primary school or like in higher level school and the society needs. And this is also what I heard when I went to the township, and they told us like when they finish their education, there's no job for them. But I'm curious to ask, like, if all the, I won't say all, like most of them, the schools or universities like train the people to the specific needs of the society currently needs, will that be a limitation for I don't know, for the people from the local people to achieve higher achievements or something else? Because like future is not certain, like it's not for sure that you work for this kind of stuff and it won't change in the future.
All right, so take more questions. So that's all for Zanele.
So I had the chance to drive around Mpumalanga a little bit and notice a real difference between like provincial roads of Mpumalanga and the N4, which was right there, the N1 and the N2. And it got me thinking around, you know, the provincial governments versus the national government, and kind of, is that representative of an issue where the provincial governments aren't working as effectively as the national government, and should the national government support some of the less affluent provincial governments? So just trying to understand a little bit about your thoughts on the provincial versus national governments.
All right, we've got Linda will answer that one.
I have a question on how the transition in the economy from like being a primary exporter of raw materials to manufacturing value-added goods come along, and probably what were the 2-3 drivers that enabled that transition?
Sorry, could you please repeat the question just a bit slowly?
Sure. So I just want to understand how the transition in the economy from like primarily exporting raw materials to, I mean, now exporting value-added goods by a lot of manufacturing, how that's come along and what were the drivers that helped with that?
All right. Should we start with you?
Hi, I had a question around the BEE legislation. I was just curious to understand how did corporations react to this, and was it imbibed into the business strategy itself, or was it put as part of the CSR initiative of the company, and how did Shell in particular react to it?
Right. So you can take the last one.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question to Ms. Gheneez. That we have a course in Yale that teaches us corporate social responsibility, oil and wine. I know South Africa is both oil and wine producing country. So these two businesses seems to me like a dilemma. That one thing is sustainable, like wine, but one thing is like oil. It's a Dutch disease, the use of natural resources. So how can you share a little bit your opinion on this dilemma here, and how Shell faces dilemma and approaches in Africa? Thank you.
All right, shall we start with you, Linda, on the question of governance?
Thanks, Chair. Yes. In South Africa, we've got 3 layers of government. There is the national government. Their focus basically is policy setting. That's what they should focus on. But sometimes national government doesn't do that. Tends to dictate to provinces what to do, tends to dictate sometimes to local government what to do. Perhaps it's because the fiscus comes from national treasury. And then you've got provincial government. There is a debate in this country. I think Professor Soko is aware of this debate. And I think his brains should be pricked to give leadership to our politicians with regard to this debate. There's a debate whether we still need provincial governments in this country. There is a debate that provincial government layer is a wasting the taxpayers' money, because provincial government is simply facilitating between national and local government. Local government is currently the weakest layer in this country. Highly paid executives. City managers at local government earn much more than the president of the country earns. That is where we've got a major shortage of skills. So the debate that is there is local government is where actual work happens. So people from provincial government should be migrated to local government to strengthen the skill sets of local government people. For example, whenever there's toy-toys in the country, civic protests, people are basically toy-toying against local government. They are responsible for building roads and so on. But again, you've got concurrent obligations, whereby some hospitals are run by local government, provincial government, and then clinics are run by local government. You know, it's something we should sort out at constitution-making level. There's concurrent legislation. It becomes very difficult to hold provincial government responsible where the same thing is also being done by local government. So it's something we need to sort out. But I cannot tell you where I stand with regard to the debate. I think people like Professor Soko, who is the architect of the policy framework of our national parliament, 1994. This is the man who crafted that policy framework for this country. Must be involved in that debate. Do we still need provincial government? Because frankly, there's lots of duplications, and those duplications are very costly. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. I'm not going to say anything about that. I've said enough about politics and governance. All right, Gheneez.
The BEE strategy, BEE was orchestrated or developed, the policy was developed that it had to be core to the business strategy of any company, any person that wants to operate within the economy, any corporate. So there are various elements in the BEE scorecard. There was a scorecard that gave a score, and that determined why. It was a very cleverly constructed policy, because the higher your BEE score was, the more business you would get out in the marketplace, because by doing business with you as a high BEE score, their score would increase, because procurement was quite a big part of your scorecard. So the basic elements was equity, how much black ownership, management and control, employment equity, how many black people, and included black females as well as part of the subcategories within the scorecard. Your procurement, how much of your total procurement was being procured by black-owned businesses and black women-owned businesses. And then there was skills development, how much money are you putting into developing black skills. And then there was a CSI component. So it wasn't a corporate social investment, total corporate social investment initiative. It was basically looking at all the different levels of how we can put emphasis to develop. So there was a social layer, there was the skills level, the employing black people so you can create that middle class, and then there was the ownership and control part of the legislation. So very cleverly crafted. So for that to operate in the South African business environment, you had to have it integral into your business strategy. So we had to change our procurement strategy, we had to change our recruitment strategy, our skills, what skills are we actually developing, and there were things as core and critical skills. We never ever got to defining those core and critical skills, which I think would have addressed the issue around have we been developing skills that were going to be employable into society. And that was the intention of the government. The government was saying, let's look at this and try and make sure that we're actually creating that pathway for people to get into business. So Shell had no choice. It became part of, if you want to get a manufacturing license applications, they looked at your scorecard. If somebody wanted to buy from us, they needed the scorecard. So it is still part of how you do business in South Africa, which was how it had to be. And then just in the question around the oil and the wine, sustainable, I was part of what we call the non-technical risks area in Shell. And I was absolutely amazed at how sustainable development has become core to the decision making around where Shell goes to go and explore, how they do business and when they do business. Unfortunately, energy is required, and oil is still a big part of that energy mix in the global economy. So we have to do it, but we don't. I think how we've done it, or how Shell and big corporates have done it, has had to change. How they're thinking around when we go into an area, and I found that this was the fascinating part about the Karoo. The Karoo is really untouched. It's they call it natural. A lot of it is eroded, but it's still very much no economy. And that was the challenge that we had. So how do we balance the fact that we do not want to? We obviously must not destroy the environment. But we have to almost bring development into an environment that people call pristine, and how do we keep sustainable? And I think there were many principles that came out of that thinking. And one of the principles was, how do we create an alternate economy so that when the oil or the gas disappears, that this town is sustainable? We've seen many of those mining issues that's happened. And thinking around when we do skills, like we were thinking about, because the SKA, which is that astronomy unit, is in the Karoo, how do we combine it and maybe make Beaufort West a central area for maths and skills? So people who, it's a scientific center where computer skills might be. So that's the kind of thinking that we had to employ, which I don't think happened 20 years ago when we were doing it. So oil companies have had to think about sustainability.
Gheneez, Zanele?
Okay, I'm going to talk to the efficiency of our education system and whether going a certain route would be limiting to some children. In the last 2 years, we've had something called Fees Must Fall in this country, where students were demanding free education, which again is just a misdiagnosis of the problem. It's just the symptoms coming up to say there is a problem in our education system. But the children and the professionals have misdiagnosed that cry or that problem as a monetary issue, whereas it's a issue at the grassroots that says our education system needs to be redesigned. And maybe more than money, it's a paradigm shift that we need. In South Africa, we have the concept that it's an all or nothing. So all the students, all the children from primary school must go all the way to matric and then go to university. Whereas it's not really necessary. Some children maybe want to be musicians. Maybe they're not made that way. But you get forced. I mean, when my daughter finished her BCom honors, she came and said, this is all yours. I'm not interested in this. I actually want to go and play a piano. So it's like, I did this for you. So we force children, we force children through a path that they actually don't need, instead of understanding where their strength is, understanding what our society needs, what our economy needs, and then grooming them in a fluid way to be able to serve our economy successfully.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Zanele. David?
There was another question. I don't know who's going to take it, about transitioning from basic product
You want
to...
to take that?
No.
Okay. So what was the question about the structure of the economy? Also, South African economy, as I said, is now dominated by services, which account for 65% of GDP. Agriculture still plays a part, but it has declined precipitously, and mining has also declined, but mining is very strategic because it contributes the largest share of our foreign earnings. And then we have a manufacturing sector which has played a very important part in the economy, but it has also declined. So that is the structure of the economy. All right, let's take more questions. Sanusi?
Yeah, to Zanele, you mentioned about entrepreneurship as either a skill or attitude, which I think is a really good point. And to your point about raising kids to develop this attitude of entrepreneurship. So what concrete, specific things, for example, that I can tell my 5-year-old daughter to try to nurture her entrepreneurial spirit, if you will like. So if you have some concrete examples. And just a quick one to Gheneez. I think Shell is notorious in Nigeria for some of its activities, especially around the Niger Delta. I understand that there are issues from the local community, so people perhaps are bombing some of the pipelines, so they have issues, but like just more broadly speaking, a lot of international companies will come into Africa and have different standards of operation, and it's well documented that Shell also does that, so it has agreed to, for example, pay money in settlements for its own negligence. So like, why would multinational companies have different standards of operation in Africa versus in their home countries, vis-a-vis, for example, like human development, environmental issues? So like, I just wanted to hear your opinion about that.
All right, thank you, Sanusi. More questions?
More of a question for my understanding. Has South Africa considered foreign investment in education sector? Private investment is what I'm thinking.
All right. I said more? More questions?
I just wanted to get clarification from David, possibly on the initial question that you asked him, because you said if, let's say the students were interested in making investments into South Africa or anywhere really in Africa, what sort of places would be good places to invest in? I heard a little bit about IT and the financial sector, but if that's it, then there's no question. But if there are other sectors that are interesting, I'd love to
All right, should we start with you, Elizabeth?
Yes, I'll take the one with regards to private sector investing in education. I think it's known, it's well known in this country that private sector organizations are investing massively in education. For instance, here at the GSB, a lot of MBA candidates here are sent by their corporates to study for the MBA and so on. But I know that companies like Anglo-American, Anglo-Platinum, and lots of other companies are investing massively in education. But perhaps it is the monitoring of that process that we should look at. There are corporates that even help build schools in needy areas in this country. And I wish they could do more of that. So it is work in progress.
All right, Gheneez?
Sure. Shell globally, and I worked on the global team, so for me, there isn't a thing of different standards. Okay, Shell has one standard because of the reputational risk that involves an operating company. I think what happens is when they enter a country, there are different operating models that exist. And particularly in Nigeria's perspective, the operating company was the Nigerian government. Okay, Shell was as a minority shareholder. So when you start getting partnerships, it becomes very difficult, particularly if you're working with the government as your operating partner. So I'm not going to condone what Charles said. I'm not very intimate with what has actually happened on the ground there because I've been mainly based in South Africa. But I can only judge from a Shell perspective, that's one of the things that they would not compromise globally is the health, safety, security, and environmental standards. It's done operated on a global standard, and they would stop and pull out at any time if they knew that was being compromised. Nigeria, I think, is a much more complex arrangement, and I think it's almost it should be stood alone on its own. To actually diagnose it as a case study around how Shell has had to operate within the Nigerian context. I think in all the other countries, there's fewer issues such as Nigeria, but what has developed over the last 10 years within Shell is this non-technical risk department, which is quite a strong, globally standardized unit that actually makes sure that there are standards around those things because they have learned. They've made mistakes in certain areas which has cost them gravely reputationally. And I think because of the awareness of people around companies operating within their countries, I mean, it's a great example with South Africa. We had to put in really high standards to make sure that we mitigate any risk of environmental damage. And from a global company's perspective, they've realized that they have to put as much emphasis on a non-technical issue and as much money into solving non-technical risks as the technical solution. And the non-technical risk team, which was what I was part of, has to challenge technical teams around economic, environmental, and social issues that could arise from their operations within a country.
All right, thanks, Gheneez. I just want to say something about investment, private investment in education. Because of the challenges that plague the primary education sector, we've seen private investors establishing schools. There's a company in South Africa called Kuro, which has invested heavily in building schools that would also accommodate those children who live in the townships, who are frustrated with the current schooling system, and they're going to these schools now. So education, especially primary education, has now become one of the fastest growing areas in terms of investment. So if you're looking for opportunities there are opportunities there.
Your question is very dangerous because it will keep us here for 10 hours. So I'll try and give you the short version. We undermine the enormity of the mind, especially in children. They're actually smarter than us. If we don't restrict them and put them into boxes of saying you have to do this or you don't have to do this, their minds actually are very broad. I'll give you a personal example. When I was brought up as a child, whilst we were surrounded by poverty, my father told me that I'm the best, and I believed that. So when he had to go and fight for the country and left my mother and 7 children with no food, my mother earned 320 a month, we had to find a way of surviving. I was 9 years old. I had very small fingers. I started plaiting people, and I ended up making in a day what my mother made in a month. So the entrepreneurial spirit just came out. So if you leave the spontaneity of the mind to take its own shape, your 5-year-old daughter just needs to know that everything is possible and she can do it.
David?
In terms of other sector where there's opportunity, depends. I mean, there's so many opportunities that it's not only in technology. I've been working with people who import and export foodstuff in East Africa. and it has really been very, very, very successful. It will depend on which sector you are at. We can engage, and then we can see what. There's a former classmate on the MBA about 7 years ago from Germany. He decided to stay, and he started a business about 6 years ago where he buys second-hand hospital beds in Germany, refurbished them, because apparently they change their hospital beds every 2 years or every year with more technologically advanced beds. So he buy whatever that is and he refurbish it and he supply to hospital in Africa. And his business has been very, very successful. So he's got clients, hospital in Kenya and Uganda, you name it. So, I mean, depending which sector you are at and what kind of things you want to do, then you can look at the opportunities that are there. But there are definitely so much opportunities. Yeah.
All right, thanks, David. Now we've come to the conclusion of our panel discussion. Before we close, I want to invite our panelists to make some closing remarks. You know, if you have a message for the participants in the program, what would that message be?
One message, Prof, is we are global citizens, which means we belong to one family, all of us. There's no borders dividing us. We are global citizens. We are one person. Go out there and spread the good word about Africa. It's got opportunities, and make use of those opportunities. Thank you.
I think from my side, I would just say as students with knowledge and have been exposed to what you've been exposed to, have the courage and determination to work with Africa. I think it's a vibrant, there's lots of opportunities, it's a vibrant place, it's got a lot of cultural diversity, diverse thinking, and you've got to have the courage and determination to embrace that and to embrace the goodness that South Africa and Africa has got to offer the world.
All right. Zanele?
Me, it's an invitation that you take our details and you leave us your details so that we stay in touch, we share knowledge, and we find out answers and support from each other.
Well, I would say that there's so much opportunities because there's so many things that still need to be done. The challenges on the continent actually, if you look at it from a different perspective, are actually opportunities. So whatever that is lacking is a business opportunity for you to supply it. So don't be so much turned off by the challenges, the infrastructure challenges or other challenges. Actually see it as an opportunity because you can, if you could see that challenge, it means because you can apport or bring the solutions to the table. So there's so much opportunities on the continent. Try to be open-minded and see what you can do.
All right, I would like to thank our panelists, Linda, Gheneez, Zanele, and David, for the time that they've given us this morning. They're very busy people. They took time off to share with us insights about doing business in Africa. We really appreciate the wisdom that you shared with us today. And we can do the honors. We have some gifts for you here, tokens of appreciation.